Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video I'll show you how I made the Wheatfield Wasteland inspired bases for my Corvus Cabal. In this video I'll show you how I made both of these bases that I'm going to use for my Corvus Cabal Warband. And here's one of them on my favourite miniature of all time, the Shrike Talon. I love this miniature so much. And here's the Wheatfield kind of wasteland theme that I wanted to use for the warband. So I'm kind of learning as I go here, and so what I thought I'd do was make a cardboard kind of dummy run first, just to see what the colour scheme worked and get all the mistakes out of the way before I moved on to these two. After making the bases for the K-Knight Shadowstalkers and the Scions of the Flame, I've really been thinking more about what these bases are going to look like on a tabletop perspective, so trying to imagine them like further away rather than really up close. So I'm kind of taking that into account with this build here. Let's get on with it. So here's the materials I used. I used some old sawdust, some saw-ins I made, some budgie sand, some little bits of flock, and a little skull from the Citadel skull pack. And then here's the base that we're going to use. And then I made little tufts out of the sawdust just to look like old wheat or straw on the edge of a field. The glues I used are the super glue Gorilla Glue and the Gorilla Wood Glue. And the first step was to take that Gorilla super glue, just apply a little bit onto the base. And we just wanted a little bit here, and that's going to be for the skull. And it's good to use tweezers, but for some reason I just picked it up and put it on with my fingers. But there we go, just sat that in the glue. And that's not going to take long to set. This Gorilla Glue is really quick to act. And then I got a little tuft of sawdust there and shavings, and I kind of roll them together, pick out some long ones from a pile, and then roll them together. I'm just going to stick them into that super glue, and that's going to keep those in place really quick. And all little bits flick off, but that's okay. As long as the main bulk of them is in that glue, that's going to set quite quickly. And then I made another little tuft and added that to the other part of the glue as well. And there we go. You can see that all stuck on. And I like the way it kind of hangs over and around the skull. And as if the dead head has made it grow a little bit more maybe. And now I'm taking some wood glue. And this is being spread all over the base. And you could use PVA for this. I just really like the wood glue as it sets quite quickly and works really well for that. And I'm just keeping the rim of the base as clean as possible, just wiping it off as I'm doing it and making sure I get a nice spread. And this glue sets really flat, so you don't have to pile it up too much. Now I'm going to sprinkle on my budgie sand, and I'm putting loads on, making sure I cover the whole base, give it a complete covering, and even in amongst the hay and everything, get it right in there. And you don't need to tap it down, but just make sure all the glue is covered, and then you can pick it up and just give it a little tap, and that'll get rid of the excess, and then put that to one side to dry. And that's all we need to do for that stage. Now I'm just wiping the edge off again. And there you go. You can see what that looks like now with the budgie sand. Putting on those tiny bits of flock, and they're quite coarse, so they're going to act as like little stones. So I'm putting a bit more of the wood glue in places. Now I made a mistake here. I should have put these little bits of flock on before the budgie sand, so I'm almost going back a step. So if you're going to make it like this, then definitely put it on the base first before the budgie sand. So now I've put those bits of flock on. I'm just going to put a little bit more budgie sand on so that it fills in the gaps and makes those stones look like they're kind of popping out the ground. Just give that a little tap off, just like we did before, and then that's all ready. Leave that dry. It's going to take about 30 minutes. And now it's back to the super glue. And I'm just putting a little bit of super glue here on those tufts of hay. And I want to stick a little bit more of the sawdust on, so it's a bit bushier. So I'm popping that on. You could use wood glue for this, and I tried that on some of the other bases I made, and that works nicely. But I found with the super glue, it's going to dry like almost straight away and be really strong. And there we go. That's all attached. And now I'm doing a different base, which I'm going to use for one of the warband fighters, which is the leader. And so for that, I'm going to use a bigger base, a bit of cork tile, some really longer bits of sawdust, and a couple of stones. And so I just put some super glue on there. I'm sticking that piece of cork down, And then once that's dried, again, this doesn't take long at all, I'm going to flip it over and just run my knife around the edge, and then just a little blade, run it around the edge, but not all the way through, because I want to tear this cork off, and that's going to make it a little bit more coarse and look a little bit like kind of stone or earth, as if the earth has been piled up a little bit. And now I'm just going to use my blade just to chip away a little bit, give it a bit more character. You don't want it dead straight all the way around, so I'm just putting almost the tip of the blade in and just flicking the cork off, so it just tears it away in little chunks, and that's just all nice to give a variety, makes it more natural. We don't want it looking uniform and neat. And now I'm going to apply the stone, so a little bit more super glue, and just this little stone. I just got this from the road. They were re-gravelling part of a road, like a lane, so I just picked some up, washed it off, dried it out, and then I've got some great little stones that we can use. And then I also glued on the skulls like we did before. So that's that ready to go. And then I covered that with flock and budgie sand, just like we did with the previous one. Right, with everything really dry, it's time to paint. So I got some Avalon Sunset base paint, and I covered all the area with that except for the hay and the skulls. And I'm putting a nice thick coat on of this. This is going to go all over that. I use a little bit of water just to wet it down and help it get into the little crevices, but not too much. And then just give it a nice coat. And I'm just using old scruffy brushes here. I don't want to use any of the nice ones. So this does the job. As long as we get a nice thick coat, we're good. And if it goes onto the rim, that doesn't matter too much, because we're going to tidy it up later with paint at the end. But I still try and be as careful as I can not to get any paint on the rim there. And I just keep going. And on some of the bases I glued the hay on after I painted. Okay, once that was completely dry, I took some ceramite base white paint from Citadel, and I used that for the skull. I'm just going to give that a complete coat, nice and thick, and that's going to cover that skull ready for painting later on. Same white paint, I took a makeup brush, and that's the brand, very vegan, put some paint on the bristles there, and then I worked that paint right in there, getting lots of paint in the bristles, and then used the kitchen roll to wipe off as much paint as I could, so that it barely any shows when you brush the paint on like your hand or on a surface. So we want this really dry. We want just a little bit of white, and then I'm going to start gently rubbing that across all the raised areas to give us a highlight. And these makeup brushes are perfect for this. Once I got these makeup brushes, the dry brushing on the miniatures was much better. So I can definitely recommend getting some of these. And I think they were about £3 each, if I remember rightly. So, you know, you can find these quite cheap, but they do a great job. The bristles are softer, and you can really get a nice subtle effect. And I find it doesn't come out too powdery either, so really nice. And you've got a lot more control over those raised areas too. And so as I was going, and once you're used to how much paint is actually on the bristles, you can be a bit rougher and then get a bit more off on the rocks. Right, next we got the contrast Yanden yellow, and I'm going to give this a coat all over the painted areas, trying to avoid that hay as much as possible, and also not putting any on the skull. And I'm not going too thick here. I'm not putting lots of paint on, just enough to give us a little bit of tone, a little bit of shade. But we're not going to get a lot of shade from this, but it's just going to dull it down a little bit and give us some nice colour there, because that Avalon yellow is just too bright. So we'll just bring it down a little bit with this, and then we'll move on to the next paint. And this is a darker yellow called Nazdrag yellow, and this is contrast again. And I'm going to use this to go over all the areas that are rocks or areas where I want a little bit extra shade. And I'm doing this while that previous layer of paint is still wet. So these are going to blend in and give a more natural kind of blend between the two colours. And I'm just dotting it on almost onto each rock and letting that bleed down into the paint below. And also under the skull, there's going to be a little bit of shadow, a bit more grime building up. So I'm putting a bit in there, working it into the hay, but not onto the hay, just to give a bit of shadow there as well. And so just being quite random with it, but imagining where there would be more shade. And I did exactly the same with that larger base, and I even went over that stone and everything. So painted it in exactly the same way with the same paints and the same stages. The next paint was Contrast Skeleton Horde, and this is going to go on the skulls, and a nice thick coat of this. Really generous I'm being with this, getting it right in those eye sockets and any cracks on the skulls. Really getting a lot of paint on my brush, wiping it off and trying to like make sure I guide that paint into the cracks, crevices, and even behind into the really heavily shaded areas. And then I've got some Agrax Earthshade next, and now I'm using this just to dot around a tiny bit on each individual kind of rock that's popping out of the ground. And I'm not putting too much of this on, and I don't even think you have to do this stage, but I just wanted a little bit more definition and variety. So I'm just putting a little bit on in little areas where there'd be more kind of heavy shade and where any rocks are protruding from the ground. Next I took some Mournfang Brown. This is a base paint from Citadel, and this is going to be for the rims. And I got some blue tack, pop that on the end of the makeup brush, and then push the base onto that blue tack, and that's going to give us a bit of control so we can spin that around as we paint the rims there. And usually I do these black on the past 2 warbands I've done, but I wanted to mix it up a bit, and I thought this Mournfang Brown would go really well with this kind of deep yellow colour, and it'll also work well with the miniatures once we mount them on the bases. So 1 coat of this isn't going to be enough, so we'll finish this first coat and then we'll let it dry thoroughly, and that's really important. So a nice thick coat for the first coat, let it dry, and then we'll repeat the process, giving it a second coat, and that goes on really nice rich colour. And I think this works really well with the yellows. And you can see here, I'm spinning that brush as I'm painting, so I'm almost not having to move the brush that much. I'm kind of making the base do the work for me and just moving it as I go. There we go, there's our 2 bases, all done in the Wheatfield Wasteland theme to a tabletop battle ready standard, and these didn't take too long at all, and I think from what we used and how we did them, got a really nice effect that's going to work perfectly with the theme and narrative I'm going with the Corvus Cabal. And this is the miniature I'm going to be gluing onto the base once she's painted, and I've made a video on how to attach painted miniatures to painted bases, so you can check that out too. With the Knight Shadowstalkers and Scions of the Flame, I painted all the miniatures and all the bases separately, but I found with the Corvus Cabal, they're so fragile and fiddly, and there's only the kind of one small bit gluing them to the base. So for these, I've glued them to the base, then painted the miniatures, and then I did the bases. On one of the miniatures, I've painted the base first, and then I'm going to paint the miniature second, and I think that could be a better way of doing this, so we'll find out soon. Look out for the Shrike Talon painting video coming soon, and some of the other Corvus Cabal Warband fighters. I'll be doing videos for each of those. I'll put links in the description below to everything I used in this video, and there'll be affiliate links, but they won't cost you anything extra. In fact, they could save you up to 20% with Element Games, and every sale made through an affiliate link, I'll get a small commission, and that's going to help me develop the channel. So thanks so much for that support, I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you, and thanks so much for watching, I hope it's been helpful. Please like the video if you like it, subscribe for more videos like this, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.